A Labor landslide, a Liberal humiliation and a One Nation arrival the morning after the South Australian election earthquake. Premier Peter Malinauskas joins me in a moment. And as the fuel crisis deepens, Energy Minister Chris Bowen on what motorists can expect if this war drags on. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. We'll come to the Iran war, the global oil shock and how Australia is responding shortly. First to the South Australian election. And as expected, Labor easily won, but the scale of this victory was historic. On the close of counting last night, Labor was sitting on a record 32 seats after the Conservative vote fractured. The Liberals reduced to just 4 seats with 1 independent and 10 seats still undecided. One Nation is ahead in 2 of those. It may not end up being a big presence in the parliament, but One Nation's impact on this election was enormous. Take a look at the statewide primary vote. Labor on just over 39%, so barely changed. One Nation seizing the second highest vote share of nearly 22%, demolishing support for the Liberals, pushed into 3rd place with a vote of less than 19%. Here's how the votes changed. A slight drop there for Labor, but a surge for One Nation, almost all at the expense of the Liberal Party. Premier Peter Malinauskas acknowledged the surge in support for One Nation and spoke of the importance of both patriotism and unity.
We can and we should wave our flag with pride, knowing that Aussie patriotism sometimes means sitting with a stranger and having a cuppa or a frothy and arguing about the footy, not our faith. It's been a hot summer in Australia, so maybe we should all look forward to the temperature coming down just a little bit.
Pauline Hanson, meanwhile, hailed this as One Nation's best result in 30 years and now has her eyes on what's next.
I think the rest of Australia is going to be watching what's happening here tonight. And I think it's very important to see for Farah, and I also will set a strong team for Victoria. So if you're from Victoria, you're watching this, we're coming to support you down there. Stand candidates.
Well, Premier Peter Malinauskas joins me now. Congratulations on the big win and thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks, David.
So, look, this was an extraordinary result for Labor. You've won really as a centrist at a time of great political disruption that we're seeing here and around the world. What lesson do you think your Labor colleagues in other states and federally should take from this?
Oh, look, I think the Prime Minister and the entirety of the federal Labor team are very conscious of the fact that you've got to make sure that first and foremost the economic settings are right to ensure that a growing economy doesn't leave people behind and actually delivers a dividend for more people to have a degree of prosperity in their lives. And that's, of course, a very difficult thing to achieve, particularly in a global climate like the one that we have now. But culture and economics, I think, are always front of mind. And I think that's true and in many ways played out in the result we saw in South Australia last night. And no doubt everyone will just continue to get to work to focus on what we believe in, our value system, and how that can guide a degree of economic justice and growing prosperity in our country.
Look, more than 1 in 5 South Australians voted for One Nation. That's a lot of voters, really unhappy, I suppose, with the status quo. Last night in your speech, as we saw, you appealed for the temperature to be brought down. You read a Henry Lawson poem about patriotism and respecting each other. But will you need to respond more in a policy sense to what's happened here with the One Nation vote? Do you think you will need to address the concerns more of those who clearly feel the system's not working for them?
Well, you look at One Nation's contribution in the South Australian campaign, David, what you see is a lot of rhetoric, and almost zero policy. And they made a virtue out of almost. That they're not offering a policy proposition to the people of our state in terms of how we govern ourselves. So I think, what we have to do is mainstream parties of government, and obviously Labor being the most important in my view, is to make sure that we're keeping an eye on, the cultural, sense of the party itself and what we stand for, but at the same time making sure that we do offer a clear policy agenda, particularly around growing prosperity and sharing opportunity. Now, if we do both those things in concurrence with one another, I think it will expose One Nation as being a little bit more symbolic rather than serious about using the power of government to achieve things for people.
Nonetheless, right now, One Nation is having an impact. They've eaten into the Liberal vote. Do you worry that they will start to eat more into the Labor vote? And did you see that in the results last night at all?
Yes, I think is the short answer. I think that we saw Liberal voters moving to both One Nation and Labor, but I also think we saw Labor voters moving to One Nation, and that's why I'm very deliberate, and even on the phone this morning to my parliamentary colleagues to say, look, no one can get ahead of themselves here. There are, while there are obviously clearly big questions for the Liberal Party, we shouldn't be shy from putting the mirror up to ourselves and asking what more we can do, particularly in outer suburban Adelaide and regional South Australia.
So this may not be the upper limit for One Nation. You suspect they could rise further?
Well, the moment you start assuming the upper limit on any political opponent, David, is the moment that your primary vote starts going down. Now, we've been able to preserve ours in this election largely, but I don't think we should take too much comfort from that, because the idea of safe seats, that's over, right? The idea of long-standing intergenerational party loyalty amongst families, that is out the window. So you've got to remain conscious of the fact that you're going to be very deliberate about what you are offering to the electorate and why you're offering it to the people. And that gives you the best chance of standing for something and making sure people recognise it accordingly.
On a policy sense, and this is a bit of a national question, you've been an influential Labor leader, voice in the national debate for some time. I suspect that influence will only grow after this result. We do have a big debate going on with the global crisis we're in about greater self-sufficiency, that Australia needs to have more sovereign capability. Where do you think we need to be looking next in terms of the industries that Australia should be able to do more in and be more self-sufficient in?
Well, I think last night's result, if I was going to pick one area of policy that requires ongoing sustained effort around the country, it's undoubtedly housing. I think, that social compact that we have in Australia, where one family to the next can pass on to the idea of home ownership as an aspiration, I think that's at risk. So for me, it's all in on housing. But in terms of industry policy, I think recent weeks post-Iran has demonstrated that sovereign capability has to be a necessary feature of how we set our economy up, because otherwise we put ourselves at grave risk, particularly in the global climate we're now in. And, fuel is one example. But, I'm very grateful that this federal government has demonstrated a willingness to do something about it on something as important as steel and critical minerals, which is what we're doing in both Wyler and Port Pirie in the Upper Spencer Gulf. Now, those industries would not be set to thrive. In fact, they wouldn't even survive, frankly, at the moment, had it not been for activist policy intervention on behalf of government, state and federal. So I think there is a demonstrated commitment of this from the current federal government, but we've got to look around the world around us and acknowledge that it's changing. We have to make sure that we set our country up accordingly.
Final question, Peter Malinauskas, and I have asked you before and you've previously ruled out any move to federal politics, but the morning after such a big win, is that still your view? Do you think you can actually achieve and have more influence in the position that you're currently in than going federal?
David, I've just, accepted an extraordinary privilege from the people of our state to lead, this really important part of our country for the next 4 years. And I actually think you can contribute more to what's going on around the place through this role than any other, and I'm very grateful for that. Look, I put it this way. If you think about our federation, 6 states, 6-cylinder engine, I think the South Australian cylinder or piston hasn't always been firing. Now it is. We've got the fastest growing economy in the country. Real wages are growing faster than anywhere else, and I think that means we are making a contribution to our country, and I'm very glad to lead that.
Premier Peter Malinauskas, once again, thank you for joining us the morning after such a big election night. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Well, coming up, Energy Minister Chris Bowen will join us as fears grow over Australia's fuel supply. First, let's bring in our panel And we're joined this week by Chief Political Correspondent for the Sydney Morning and the Herald and the Age, Paul Sakkal, Greg Brown, Chief Political Correspondent for The Australian, and the ABC's Chief Digital Correspondent, Clare Armstrong. Very good morning to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Paul, let's just start with some initial thoughts on what we've witnessed in South Australia. There was no surprise in Labor winning, although it is a big win. The big question was whether One Nation would turn their polling numbers into votes.
Yeah.
They have, even if it may not result in many seats.
Yeah, the populist wave has hit Australia. It's taken us a little while. We're always a few years behind the rest of the world, but it's happened. This underscores the urgency for the federal Liberal Party to get its act together. And just in case Liberals needed reminding, it is the case that a surge in One Nation kills the Liberal Party first and foremost. It might cause some problems for Labor, but it kills the Liberal Party first. I think there are some reasons to be cautious about whether this has federal implications. This was a unique state election. The South Australian Liberal Party is in disarray. Its previous leader was busted for selling drugs. One Nation was effectively a column of smoke here. Unlike Nick Xenophon, who was able to be dragged down by the Liberals in 2016, One Nation had no policy platform, no incumbent. They're running off a national vibe. But having said that, this does underscore the fact that the Liberal Party can sink into irrelevance, just as the Tories have done in the UK. And people are willing to vote for an experiment, even if it is risky. And the only way to counteract that yearning for change is for the Liberals to itself offer change.
But look, Greg, it's more than just the Liberals being in disarray. I mean, as Peter Malinauskas just said, he reckons votes went from Labor to One Nation. They obviously got votes back from the Liberal vote being down, coming back into Labor to keep their primary vote where it was. But One Nation are taking votes from both.
Yeah, and there's clearly an anxiety in the community about the direction of where Australia is heading on not only economic reasons but cultural reasons as well. I do think federal Labor are taking this surge in One Nation seriously, not just for partisan reasons, but I think they are cognizant that as the government they have to create an environment where this kind of grievance politics doesn't thrive.
And it's why Albanese is now talking more about his future made in Australia, more sovereign capability. That's a response to this.
Exactly. And I do think, and as well, his response to, I mean, would have his language been the same on the ISIS brides issue if he didn't have One Nation in his mind? Would have he been so quick to back in the US and Israeli strikes on Iran if it wasn't in this particular environment? But just going back to Paul's point, I mean, one note of caution, I think, you know, I think this is a significant vote for One Nation, but there's a few factors that do make it unique, a bit of a perfect storm. One, it was just months since this nation's biggest ever terror attack, and we're in the middle of a war where we're worried about petrol and fuel supplies, so there's high anxiety in the community, and also the Labor and the Liberal parties were completely unprepared for One Nation in South Australia for One Nation to do well this time. So that won't happen again. And also, there wouldn't have been a person in South Australia who thought that Peter Malinauskas wouldn't have been Premier today. So you could have your protest vote guilt-free.
That's right.
Yeah.
Low risk.
I think
risk.
that's a really important point. I thought it was interesting last night, Pauline Hanson in her address said that this isn't just a protest vote, this isn't about grievance politics, and then went on to say, well, I'm back to Canberra tomorrow, but don't worry, Malinauskas, I've left you a couple of landmines in the form of One Nation members of Parliament now in South Australia. You know, to describe the purpose of your newly elected representatives to be a hazard for government that might blow them up, nothing constructive, not offering anything of value, I think actually shows that it is about a protest vote, and there are a lot of conditions even beyond the state of the Liberal Party that have made people lean into that.
But that's the message a lot of people want to hear at the moment is, yes, let's just blow the system up.
That is true. It's obviously appealing.
They'll now have some members in the lower house and the upper house, and a lot of pressure and focus will be on them to see what they're actually like in Parliament as opposed to the protest vote element. Just back to the Liberals though, Paul, this could have been worse. There was some talk early in the campaign they'd be wiped out altogether. They'll end up with, probably 5, maybe 6 seats.
Yeah.
They can rebuild from that, potentially. Is there anything that the Liberals can cling to here that would give them hope?
Well, if you watched the coverage last night, you saw some very smiley Liberals on the TV, particularly because, which is kind of paradoxical given the result. Ashton Hearn made the point that the pundits all said she'd get 0 seats and she's ended up with about 4 or 5. So there was a slight achievement there to just cling on to some seats. And I think people have, I said Matt Canavan was sending around memes last night of, it's a famous meme format of a guy, celebrating as if he's won the race, but is actually in 3rd position. So you can have a really strong primary vote and not win many seats in our preferential system. I think this has brought that to life. And I think, there were Liberals watching last night to see, will the Liberal Party be totally wiped out, or will One Nation kind of, still look like a protest party?
But to be clear, this is a good result for One Nation. I mean, sure, they're not sitting on more seats than the Liberals in the Parliament, but from where they've come from to that sort of result, beating them on the primary vote.
Yes, and I think what's important as well is when you hear Pauline Hanson talk about her goals for One Nation, she flags, I think the first time she said to me that she thought she'd win 3 upper house seats in South Australia was like November last year, and that was before they started taking over the Libs in the polls. She points to that, she points to the Farrer by-election, she points to Victoria, and this is all about, there is a big structural thing going on here, and actually your colleague at The Australian, Jack Quayle, has been doing some really great reporting on the way that the South Australian changes to donation laws and all of those restrictions are going to be quite a windfall for One Nation with this high primary. They could make up to $3 million in getting that public money back if that's how much they spent. It's also the amount they can borrow against. They also get an ongoing amount of, I think he estimated, up to $800,000 a year that goes to party administration, training volunteers. So it's a huge win for them in terms of securing the structure of the party, which is where they have always failed in the past.
All right, well, just before we move on, just wanted to quickly clarify David Speers. The other David Speers was convicted of supplying, not selling drugs, just so we don't run into any trouble there.
Apologies.
No, all good.
That's a big
All right, well, time to talk to the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen. But first, it was a week when the full scale of the Iran war hit home on Australian households. After an interest rate rise, the Reserve Bank started talking about a possible recession. Fuel prices kept rising, of course, and the government warned inflation could climb much further.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, good to go.
Australian mortgage holders have been hit with back-to-back interest rate rises.
The Reserve Bank Board lifted its official rate by 0.25.
The board did not make this decision lightly.
It was a close vote and it was a close call.
I understand that this is tough news.
Well, today's a devastating day.
It'll be much worse if inflation gets built into the fibres, and then we will see the costs of everything going up.
It's clear that the government is seeking to avoid the responsibility they have.
So for my part, I'm accepting my part. I take responsibility for my part in the fight against inflation.
It's clear that the government is ignoring the spending that it is contributing to inflation.
If necessary, would you be prepared to put Australia into recession?
Well, we don't want to do that.
We need to be very careful about how we talk about this.
We don't want to have a recession, but if it's hard to get inflation down, then, we're going to have to deal with that, possibly.
They're not anticipating. Well, it's certainly not something that we're expecting. Neither of us are forecasting a recession.
The fact that petrol prices are up so substantially as well is just another problem.
The war in Iran is only adding fuel to the fire.
From coast to coast, pain at the pump.
We can't survive. We can't survive.
It's $100 extra every week now.
Petrol giants are put on notice for ripping off Australians.
They need to be open, honest and transparent.
Suppliers and retailers must not treat motorists as mugs.
I've seen no evidence of that.
The government needs to lean on them and make sure the fuel is getting to the customers.
It'd be handy if you didn't close those refineries when you're in government.
Well, I kept the last 2 open.
519 million litres of petrol and diesel has now been released.
They need to recognise that there are shortages.
There is not less supply. This is an issue of increased demand.
Get on with drilling in the Great Australian Bight.
Wrong way, go back. The nation's new fuel supply coordinator, Anthea Harris.
Fuel security coordinator will advise government.
We already have a fuel czar. His name's Chris Bowen, and he needs to do his day job.
I hope that helps give Australians more reassurance that there's no need for panic buying.
Please do not take more fuel than you need. That is how you can help.
Chris Bowen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, David. Good morning.
I want to start with fuel supply. What's the latest you can tell us about the supply of diesel and petrol coming into Australia?
Yeah, so we updated our figures yesterday, as we do weekly now, and actually supply of petrol's gone up a little bit, 38 days worth of supply, and diesel and jet fuel both at 30 days, which is pretty flat, and that indicates that while we've released more from the strategic reserve, the ships continue to arrive in good numbers, and both our refineries are working absolute full pelt, and they're both entirely 100% dedicated to Australian suppliers, not exports. So we are really seeing the same, if not slightly more, level of petrol and diesel in Australia than we did just before this crisis began.
You've been making the point, though, that from mid-April there's less certainty about whether those ships will keep coming. This is only a few weeks away. So what happens then?
So I can give you a bit of a flavour of that, David. So we get on average around 81 boats a month delivering fuel to Australia. We're aware of 6 boats that have been cancelled out of that 81 on average, and some of those have already been replaced by the importers and refiners with other sources. So that gives us, I think, some context of what we're dealing with. That's not to say that, it isn't a very challenged environment internationally, and of course the flow of oil to Asian refineries has slowed, and that has downward impacts on us. But also, I think Australians can take the context that while we are dealing with that uncertainty, we still have 2 refineries working full pelt. Would be better if we'd had more, sure, but we do have 2. And we also have the boats continuing to arrive, and the refiners and importers are working very closely with government to replace those 6 at this point that have been cancelled or deferred with other suppliers, and that is occurring.
So where were those 6 boats that have now been cancelled? Where were they coming from?
I think primarily from Asia, from the different Asian refineries. It's not a matter of government policy that they've been cancelled.
South Korea or Singapore or Malaysia?
A combination, David. I mean, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia are big. They're the big suppliers. But also some of the ships that have replaced them have come from Malaysia, for example. And so it's not a matter of government policy. It's a matter of the refineries seeing some supply problems with their crude oil, which is then impacting on their ability to deliver to their customers, including Australia, but not exclusively Australia, obviously.
Are you worried that more than 6 will be cancelled from mid-April?
Well, I've always been clear, we're in an uncertain environment, so that's why have done and are doing all the preparatory work, as I indicated during the week. But nevertheless, I do think that sort of 6 out of 80 does give us, at this point, some of the context of what we're dealing with. It's not without challenges, but also I don't want people to think, and I can understand, in the debate, people think, well, all the ships are coming now and one day they'll all stop in one go. That is highly unlikely to be the case. It's much more likely that there'll be bumps in supply, but that governments will work with the refiners and the importers to manage those and minimise impact.
So the importers are trying to find supply now from where they can. I understand they're looking at the United States and Texas in particular, but India as well. Are you okay with ships coming from India, which of course would include Russian oil?
Well, they're getting it primarily at the moment, as I said, from Malaysia, a little bit from Mexico and the United States. Now, I've always been clear, we do not support Russian oil, but we do also understand that there is a blending of Russian oil in various points of supply chain, which means it can be hard to trace. India
so Russian oil will end up here? Is that the bottom line?
This is not a change, David. There's always been challenges in identifying exactly how much oil is in the product that it gets bought from. And again, this is not an Australian issue. This is every country in the world's dealing with this. How do you deal with a complicated supply chain where oil gets blended? It's not all oil from one country that goes into a delivery. It all gets blended in. But our view on Russian oil is very clear. We don't support we don't support the Putin regime maximising their oil exports, and therefore we are supportive of the international efforts in relation to that.
Finding supply from different parts of the world can come at a much higher expense. Is the government willing to subsidise the importation of fuel to keep the price down here?
No, our focus at the moment, my entire focus is on security of supply, on delivery. And again, we've always been clear, pretty upfront, and as has previous governments, to be fair, the biggest impact on petrol prices will be the international oil price. That has always been the case and will continue to be the case.
Let's turn to the distribution of fuel that's here. You said a little earlier there's actually more supply here now than there was before the war began. So why are so many petrol stations in Australia unable to get supply?
Well, I think what we've dealt with, David, is a combination of things. Obviously, we had a huge spike in demand, and that's just a fact. 100% increase in demand in a few days, and whether it's petrol, diesel, toilet paper, any commodity, that is a supply chain is not going to cope with that.
Did that take you by surprise? That doubling
when
of
demand doubles. When demand doubles. Well, you know, obviously the bombing of Iran occurred on the 28th of February. The National Security Committee met at 8:30 the next morning. I'm a member of that committee. The Prime Minister put me on that committee for this purpose, for this eventuality, because energy will always be a national security matter. Obviously, we're focused on things like gas and coal, and as well as oil and petrol.
I'm just wondering if you were expecting this demand spike, though. Is it what you expected?
Well, I think you should always expect Australians to be concerned when they see oil ships being bombed on their televisions at night. So yes, that was understandable and expected. Obviously,
so why have we seen these distribution problems then, with petrol stations unable to get supply?
Well, David, if I could just finish the point. We've seen a massive increase in demand accompanied by that increase in regional areas. Obviously, the regional areas are where the supply chain is the hardest to manage. It takes longer to get from Geelong and Brisbane to the various regional areas. You've also got lots of rural suppliers, distributors and service stations working on very tight margins and then not always able to access fuel that's available. You've also got the spot market working there. So what the refineries have had to do is, understandably under the law, prioritise those for whom they have contractual obligations. The spot market hasn't really been operating, and all that's had its biggest impact on rural and regional Australia.
Well, it is having a big impact in rural and regional Australia, on farmers, on trucking, on motorists generally. Your new fuel supply coordinator is providing information, but doesn't, as I understand it, have power to direct supplies anywhere. You do, though, Minister. You do have those powers under the Liquid Fuel Emergency Act. At what point will we get to when you actually trigger that act and use that power to direct supply?
Yeah, David, that's right. The National Fuel Emergency Act 1984. It's never been invoked, ever, not through the first two Gulf Wars, COVID. It's not designed to be invoked lightly. It really has powers primarily around defence and health in the first instance to ensure that those key areas are getting diesel that they need, but also other forms of fuel. I would need to be satisfied that there's a real shortage and that the powers under that Act are useful. I'd need to advise Her Excellency, the Governor-General, of that. I would need advice. I can tell you I wouldn't do that without advice from our National Oil Emergency Committee, which has been Oil Supply Emergency Committee, which has met now, I think, 7 times. It has.
Just who's on that? Just tell us who's on that committee.
Representatives of every state and territory, as well as Commonwealth representatives. They've been meeting very regularly, much more than in previous crises, much more than the Ukraine crisis.
And that would need to be a collective decision, would it, that we've reached the point to trigger that act?
Yeah, I wouldn't exercise those quite remarkable powers unless I had pretty strong advice that it was necessary in the circumstances. And obviously, it's something I would work through with the states. I'm not envisaging needing that. I'm certainly not hoping that we need that. I certainly don't envisage it being necessary. But of course, it's there. In extreme, if necessary.
But I guess that's what a lot of people are wondering. If this war drags on for another couple of weeks, will we get to the point where you will have to trigger that act and do things like fuel rationing?
Well, I mean, if you look at, again, there's existing plans here. There's the National Liquid Emergency Fuel Policy Response. Yeah, that's not an act, it's a response. It's actually a COAG, which was before the National Cabinet agreed this 20 years ago. And it still exists. And it runs through the different powers that the states and territories have, what the Commonwealth Minister has, what you would do before you get there, voluntary measures, encouragement, etc. We're a long way from that, David. We're a long way from that. And as I said,
what does long way mean, though? Just to give people a sense.
Well, I mean, as I said, if we've got, at this point, say 74 out of the 80 ships that we expect arriving over April and May, we've got our refineries working full pelt and not exporting any diesel or petrol to any other country, just supplying Australia, which is the situation now, after some changes I made a couple of weeks ago. That would indicate to me that we are continuing to see our fuel supply being strong. Yes, you know, that doesn't mean, I understand people hear me say that and then they say, well, I can't get petrol at my service station, both things can't be true. Well, actually, both things can be true. We can have strong fuel imports into Australia and our refineries working very well, and also have distribution challenges, unacceptable distribution challenges if you're in a regional area and struggling to get fuel. We have, you know, a number of petrol stations around the country. Again, in the greater scheme of things, yes, it's a small percentage of the service stations that can't get fuel. But does that mean it's easy for those people who rely on that service station?
So just coming back to the question...
No, it's not. It's a big problem for those people.
So no rationing for the next, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? When do we get to the point where this becomes a necessity?
Well, again, David, there's a process in place. I've had a meeting with my state and territory colleagues. They have strong powers. Traditionally, when in those rare instances, when I was a kid, maybe when you were a kid, David, in the 80s in Sydney, I remember petrol rationing was done by state governments. The state governments do have powers there. Yes, the Commonwealth Government, under the Fuel Emergencies Act, has powers. We are not contemplating at this point needing to use any of those powers. Of course, they're there. And I think that can also give Australians reassurance that, yes, there are powers there and there's plans in place and prudent contingency planning for the worst, should this get worse and should it roll on for a long time. But I really, because we're sending the message to Australians that please buy as much fuel as you need, but no more, no less, I do think that it's important to put that in context.
What about the message from the International Energy Agency? It's telling countries that they should look at more work from home, less road usage, various ideas around cars using the roads one day and not the other. Would you urge businesses, for example, to be more flexible on work from home, let people stay home?
Well, I think that's a sensible thing to do in any environment, really. Work from home has become an important part of
But in this Australian oil crisis moment.
Australian working life. And again, I think some people would already be doing that. There are other people for whom that's not an option. And I think people would already be looking at their options to minimise their fuel use at the moment. For other people, it's a lot harder. So I don't think a one-size-fits-all approach is necessary, and the IEA report is really, if you like, a smorgasbord of options for all countries around the world to look at in terms of their own personal circumstances.
Clearly, if you've got an electric vehicle right now, you're in a much better position. Do you think EV tax breaks or indeed government incentives for home batteries should be wound back in the budget, or is it the wrong time to do that?
Well, let's look at both. The home batteries policy is an outstanding success. It's an outstanding success. 280,000 home batteries installed in just the last 8 months, and maybe relevant to your conversation with Mally, predominantly in the outer suburbs of Australia and the regions of Australia who are, this program is delivering for. It's an outstanding success. I announced some changes last year to make sure the program is sustainable. It is sustainable, and those changes are the changes that we've made. In relation to electric vehicles, slightly different issue. The Treasurer and I did announce some time ago a review. In fact, that was a review that was always planned for this point because the electric vehicle tax cut's been operating now for a couple of years. It was always planned for this time to see whether it's working as intended, whether it's the most efficient way going forward, and we'll have more to say about that on budget night.
All right, watch this space. Look, a couple of other things. The Nationals leader, Matt Canavan, reckons the government should fund exploratory drilling for oil in the Great Australian Bight. There's been exploratory drilling there before. Is it worth another go?
Well, I think Mr Canavan really would be better focusing on the economics and the engineering rather than the sort of culture war element of it. The fact of the matter is that he, when he was Resources Minister, issued licences for exploration in the Great Australian Bight, and they were handed back by BP and Chevron because they couldn't make it work. It's deep, it's geologically challenging, it's a long way from the demand sources, and so therefore the economics and engineering indicated it was too expensive. So, he had a go, fair enough. It didn't work. It's not a matter of, culture war saying, well, we're for the Great Australian Bight and you're against it. Economics and engineering indicate that it's very difficult.
OK, the Coalition's also having a go at you for being a part-time minister because of your duties as the president or co-president of the COP climate talks this year. How much time are you spending on that at the moment?
Well, let's just deal with that and deal with it in two parts, if I could, David. Firstly, the specific and then the general. Firstly, on the specific, frankly, I was astounded that the opposition would politicise a meeting with the Pacific ministers. A meeting, by the way, I've chaired for every year for the last 4 years, well before I became president of COP negotiations. And for Mr Tehan to frankly insult the Pacific ministers, including a Prime Minister and a President, who came for this meeting to say I should tell them I'm too busy, I'm too important for them, was pretty insulting to the Pacific. So that was disappointing. And, you know, Mr Turn's well aware, the day before I hosted the King and Queen of Denmark, and he thought that was okay. There was no criticism of that. So he should explain why one's okay and the other's not. In relation to COP, I'm spending no extra time on my international engagements at this point, but the difference is it's more consequential. You know, for example, we've got the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency in Sydney, in Australia this week. He's coming in the middle of the biggest energy crisis to talk to Australia, in no small part because of our role now, our heightened role in international negotiations. We in the Albanese government think Australia playing a bigger role internationally, more consequential, same amount of time. The Climate Minister is always engaged internationally, or it should be. It's a key part of the job. But it means that the time I spend on that has more impact, not more time at this point, but more impactful time. So, you know, really, I think, David, it's frankly the opposition in this situation had a chance to step up and be constructive like we did in COVID. Unfortunately, they've chosen sledges, not solutions, insults, not ideas.
A final one, Chris Bowen, the South Australian election result. We heard Peter Malinauskas earlier make the point that there are still some warning signs there for Labor in One Nation's emergence. What do you take, what does federal Labor take from this result?
Well, firstly, congratulations to Mali. He has cemented his place as a Labor great in history, and not just by the size of the election win, which is, you know, eye-wateringly large, but because he's led a very active reformist government. And in my case, and in my interest, you know, a jurisdiction with the highest renewable ambition in the world, really, and, you know, despite the right-wing noise machine, the South Australian people told me to get on with it. But we in our government agree with Mali. I mean, we take not one thing for granted. It's about delivery, delivery, delivery for the outer suburbs. And again, I think it's easy for people who don't live in the outer suburbs, I mean, I do live in the outer suburbs, to have views about what people in the outer suburbs think. You know, take, for example, high EV take-up and battery take-up that we've talked about. I'm here in Parramatta. It's Polestar Parade out here, you know, and Blacktown is BYD Boulevard. People are on this transition. And our highest battery take-up has been in the outer suburbs and regions of Australia as well. So it's about delivery, and it's about helping Australians with cost of living pressure in a way that also supports the fact that we can reduce our emissions and introduce more cheaper electricity. And David, we haven't had a chance to talk about the fact that the draft electricity prices came out today, which showed reductions of up to 10% for households and 20% for small businesses, which again is an indication that turns out renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy, and when we're using less gas and more renewable energy, it's putting downward pressure on prices.
Well, I'm sure we'll talk more about that at the next opportunity. Energy Minister Chris Bowen, thank you for joining us this morning.
Great pleasure, David. Good on you.
Coming up, we'll look at what Donald Trump is expecting from Australia when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. First, let's get back to our panel. We're joined once more by Paul Sakkal from The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, Greg Brown from The Australian, and the ABC's Clare Armstrong. So, Paul, on fuel, we heard there from the Minister confirmation that 6 of about 80 or 81 ships have now been cancelled. Obviously, there's a concern that more could be, but the message still seems to be that everything's okay. There's enough coming. They're finding other supply where they can.
That's the message now. Could change quickly, and when it does, it could change dramatically. That's a worst case scenario, the potential for a real drop off in supply. But if you listen to the IEA, which is the global foremost authority on this matter, this is the worst global energy crisis in history, worse than those in the 70s. And we know the kinds of measures we needed then. I thought there were 2 important points out of that interview and slight changes in language. One, Chris Bowen is emphasising the state powers here, not the federal emergency powers. The view at the highest level of government, higher than the minister, is that the feds do not want to be the leading government in pushing for rationing and encouraging behavioural change. That will create a COVID-style politics in the country where the federal government has taken this leadership role on how people behave in a crisis. The other important point I thought was the minister opening the door to kind of softer types of non-informal rationing, encouraging people to stay home, saying if you can stay home, maybe that would be a good thing to do. So raising the idea up that measures might be needed, but try not to be sharp in how those messages are delivered.
I was just going to say on the state thing, there's a couple of not well understood areas of the actual legislation here, which is for the government to actually really start rationing at a federal level and direct where fuel goes or doesn't go. They need to declare what's called a liquid fuel emergency, and that requires there to be actual established mathematical shortages. There are lower thresholds in some of the state-based legislation where it can just be a concern or perceived issue rather than a demonstrable one. And I think what's really interesting about where the government sits at the moment is if it does this trigger when maybe we are not in a technical supply shortage, that's going to be an issue.
I think, though, on that state government point, Albanese was actually asked about this yesterday and said, will you consider rationing? He said that's a matter for
the states.
Yeah, for the states.
But they have the federal power,
yeah,
even if it's a higher level to trigger it.
Well, I don't think that's good politics, quite frankly, because it sounds a bit like I don't hold a hose. And the fact is that before there's any, the first form of rationing will be on a voluntary basis. You know, the federal government, my understanding is they think what the IEA has proposed about sort of demand management sounds pretty sensible. You would think that would be done through a national cabinet process, and I don't think it would be a good idea for the federal government to look like they're not running the show.
And I think the Prime Minister's response there on, and you referenced the Scott Morrison I don't hold a hose moment, his instinct is to not drive an urgent response in a crisis. His key equity, really, this government, is the ability to project stability, to not look like they're, running too quickly and making dramatic responses. I'm not suggesting they haven't taken crises seriously, but his instinct is to watch and wait for the moment where there's a prospect that we're in a February 2020 moment, that the world might change significantly next month, and that urgency is exactly what's required. And if the government does project this message of calm for too long a period and it gets real very quickly, it will turn into a big political problem.
I mean, I guess the fuel price being what it is right now does impose some sort of rationing on us, right? Everybody's going to be cutting back how much they're using their vehicles.
And no. I did a bit of a deep dive on this week for a piece I wrote looking at this messaging of keep calm, don't buy more than you need, there's enough to go around. Spoke to some Labor people who, unfortunately their assessment was that Chris Bowen as a messenger, like just his style of politics sometimes doesn't really give that bedside manner that the public needs to hear. But even across the political spectrum, you've of course got everyone giving this message. It's actually not irrational to be panic buying right now. Like that, it's a rational hedge if you think something is coming in the future to prepare for it. And that's really hard, as the past government found in COVID, to mitigate because people don't think that they are behaving irrationally. And I think the bigger problem coming down the pipeline once we get beyond fuel hitting $3 and that immediate issue at the Bowser is grocery prices, housing construction, telcos rely on fuel for all of these other parts of society.
Well, the construction sector, the knock-on effects. The coalition are absolutely saying it's Chris Bowen that's the problem here, part-time minister, all of that stuff. But has the coalition put forward any ideas what should be done in this moment?
Well, I mean, they have been critical of the government blaming it on panic buying. My view on the panic buying messaging is that that's important. I think it's fair enough that they're out there telling people that they shouldn't be panic buying, that we actually do have enough supply for everyone as long as people aren't panic buying. I think there's a fair criticism, though, that clearly once there was a distribution problem and it wasn't getting to everywhere in the regions, I think that messaging of panic buying needed to be accompanied quicker with real action, and I think that's when they could have released the reserves
getting more fuel into these petrol stations. Is there any ideas out there beyond drilling in the bind?
Well, Bowen made the point earlier that in COVID, Labor were critical, but they were also constructive and backed ideas, and that he hadn't really seen that from the opposition, and that they haven't really come forward. Other than Angus Taylor has been talking about how the two remaining refineries shouldn't be sending fuel offshore. He's tried to link it to emissions reductions programs, but the way that that system is working, that's not really accurate to suggest.
One of the other ways we're trying to make sure we get supply is real reliance on diplomacy. I mean, some other countries are just hoarding fuel. Our very senior ministers are talking to Korea, talking to China, talking to other Asian nations and saying, hey, you're still getting our coal and gas. We expect deliveries. On the panic buying message, I think the key criticism from the coalition is not necessarily around policy. It's more around tone. In the first couple of days on this issue, Chris Bowen, Tim Ayres, a few others were kind of creating the impression that there was a tinfoil hat wearing argument from the coalition. And I mean, if you look at Peter Malinauskas' politics, he is trying to win trust among Conservatives by talking about their issues so that when he tries to appeal to them, there is a believability there. I think your risk with Chris Bowen being your messenger for the government here is that he doesn't have the trust of people in primary industries, regional areas, out of suburban Australia where the pinch has been felt. So his message doesn't land.
I just think people needed extra reassurance at that time. And while they were technically right that there wasn't a supply problem, I think there had have been faster action on, say, this National Cabinet meeting and also releasing the reserves, they could see the government was actively doing something about it. I think that would have actually decreased the panic.
And look, a quick shout out for the podcast we did this week on an industry explanation of what's going on with distribution and why some stations aren't getting supply. Malcolm Roberts, not the senator, but the head of the Australian Institute of Petroleum, had a good chat with us about what's going on. He represents the 4 big petrol importers and distributors here in Australia. Look, the US president has also been floating now this winding down of operations in its war on Iran, but it comes as fears of ramping up pressure on Australia to get involved.
Warnings the entire Gulf region stands at the brink of total war.
We've not received a request from the United States. We're not contemplating sending a ship.
We will not be drawn into the wider war.
But we've had no support from, essentially, no support from NATO.
The US president adding Australia to the list of nations he's singled out on social media.
We no longer need or desire the NATO countries' assistance. We never did. Likewise, Japan, Australia, or South Korea.
It was a petulant post from a president under immense pressure.
Well, we want to know, do you have any minesweepers? Well, we'd rather not get involved, sir.
We, of course, are not participants in the conflict.
I think NATO's making a very foolish mistake. We don't need them, but they should have been there.
2 critical energy hubs have been hit in the Middle East.
Israeli forces targeting the world's largest gas reserve.
Crippling global oil reserves even further.
The objectives of denying Iran the opportunity to have a development of a nuclear weapon have been secured.
Very surprised about Australia and what? What would you like them to do?
We should get involved, and I was a bit surprised if they said no, because we always say yes to them.
What did Australia say no to?
We have done what we have been asked to do.
So Australia has now signed this statement a bunch of leaders have signed, which does seem to offer, I guess, fairly vague support for reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Doesn't make any firm commitments here, and Australia was one of the later signatories. Apparently it was all done in a bit of a hurry by the UK. We were left out. But anyway, what does this mean, though, this statement? Claire?
Well, it's essentially a commitment to try and plan to manage the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. I think what is everyone other than Donald Trump seems to know in the world right now is that there isn't actually a clear way that even if he creates and achieves objectives in this war, withdraws, the actual military action stops, there is no security now in that strait in which 20% of the world's fuel travels. You can't afford to have military permanently based there to ferry ships through that passage. This statement is really a signal from the UK in particular, which is in a bit of a different situation to Australia, saying, well, we obviously want it to be open and we'd be willing to work toward a plan. It wasn't signed by Australia initially. A lot of countries came on later that were sort of a grouping that wouldn't necessarily send a ship. And that was really where Australia got involved.
Well, I think the Prime Minister's argument is we've already sent that surveillance plane and missiles and 85 personnel. They are defending the UAE, but by effect also defending the Strait of Hormuz. That's the argument anyway. Look, at the end of the day, Donald Trump, to end this war, would either need to have ground troops there protecting the strait or negotiate a settlement with Iran. Both are pretty unappealing options right now. And Greg, it was interesting that Anthony Albanese this week weighed in by saying, look, the main objective of this war's been achieved. The nuclear threat is gone. That's enough.
Yeah, in a very sort of soft way, he said, please, Mr. Trump, reconsider this continuation of the war. But I do think that as that sort of messaging, I'm sure, is coming from behind the scenes increasingly from US allies.
Wrap it up.
Yeah, the economic impacts are becoming profound. I think the following day after Albanese, he probably just pre-read Jim Chalmers' speech where he's talking about inflation going up to 5% and all the economic impacts. And Trump, I think it was overnight, did say that he thinks the objectives have been achieved as well. But as far as negotiated settlement goes, that I think these things don't happen overnight. So I certainly fear there's a long way to go.
And what's going on between Donald Trump and Anthony Albanese this week, Paul? Because we saw it there, Trump saying, well, we always help Australia, disappointed they're not helping us, but there was no actual request.
There was no actual request. People will remember potentially that they spoke on the phone when Donald Trump woke Albanese up at 2 a.m. to talk about the Iranian women's soccer team, however long ago that was, a fortnight ago, and apparently he did not make any request to be involved in either the Straits or the war more broadly. I think if you think back to the early part of this term, any declaration from Trump that reflected poorly on Australia was, the press gallery was whipped up into a lather. It was taken very seriously. I think because he's lost some of his political clouts, not to suggest he's a spent force at all, but his declarations about Australia not taken quite as seriously anymore. They're seen to be just words that can be moved through.
Well, that's the Andrew Hastie response, where he comes out and says this was a petulant thing for the president to do. I think the view inside the government is we just got lumped into that initial Truth Social post when he was doing his thing. But
just
to have
Andrew
someone like Hastie say that...
explain that to us. Why is he able to push back at Trump in a way that other Conservatives are scared to do, or even the government is willing to do?
There's always been a complexity, I think, in Conservatives on how to manage the MAGA movement and the base that obviously has sort of parallels with the Conservative populist base in Australia. I think particularly because Hastie comes from that military background, like he has not shied away from essentially putting forward his expertise and understanding of this region. He made very similar, interesting comments when Trump was considering boots on the ground in Gaza, saying, I've done street by street combat in that kind of region, and that is not a place you want to be in. Him pushing back, I think, is actually him trying to clearly define his version of economic populism and this new right wing as something that's a bit different from what the MAGA movement is offering. And actually, maybe it's aligned with that base because there are plenty of people in MAGA unhappy with Trump.
And just worth note, I think Hastie's reflective of the fact that Conservative opinion across the globe is shifting on this war. The front cover of the UK Spectator, a very important publication this week, was "Is the Trump era over?" The Economist had a similar editorial. And there's a paradox here because his maximalist aims, Trump, have created the impression that he's failing because the regime is clearly not going anywhere. But on the other hand, they are degrading Iran's navy and military. They dominate the skies. So they're achieving real successes here. And so because of those successes, Trump might see an opportunity soon to pull out. But the Iranian regime is in an existential moment and they won't take any terms they don't agree with, and they can very easily continue to just, at a low-cost level, put drones across the Straits, and even if it does wrap up, the Straits might be closed for or disrupted for many months. So we're in this real catch-22 here.
Just a final one. Is talking outside of his portfolio a fair bit.
He doesn't mind that, does he?
And differentiating himself from the broader coalition line. So if you're a cynic, maybe...
You're not a cynic.
No, not at all.
Only four cynics.
Not at all. Maybe he's still got those plans one day.
Maybe. Look, just a final one quickly. You mentioned Jim Chalmers giving a speech this week, a really important pre-budget speech where he warned about how dire the outlook's going to get if this continues, but also made it clear that he wants to be really ambitious in this budget, use this crisis as a reason to go further with reform. I don't want to go through all the reform options, but a gas windfall profits tax, as our ABC colleague Isabel Rowe reported on Friday, is being looked at now by the government. The gas exporters are doing pretty well out of this crisis. Where's that going to go?
Well, I think various options on the table. I do think Chalmers wants to do something big. How keen the PM is to join him on that, I think, is up in the air. Albanese,
I kind of reject that binary a little bit. I think the reformer versus the, cautious one is maybe not about.
I think it's there.
I don't think it's necessarily
simplistic, but it's there. It's there to some extent.
I don't think it's necessarily binary. I do think that obviously Chalmers is freelancing, and Albo's saying, yeah, for sure, I'm pretty open to reform, but where it actually lands is another thing altogether. I think it's critical that if they do end up breaking election promises by adding new taxes, I think whatever they do, it should be a revenue neutral package. So if they're going to raise taxes on gas or capital gains or whatever, I do think they need to show that it's not just a cash grab and that it's real reform and they're delivering it through business and income tax cuts, which is the mistake that Bill Shorten
in 2019. Just very quickly.
I would just add, in the context of we can't not mention there was a rate rise this week. That gives you a little bit of
Which day was that, sorry?
Yeah, Tuesday. I had to Google the date because I was like, was that this week? In the context where the household budget is under immense pressure, yes, I completely agree that if you're going to move on tax, it's got to have some flow on back.
Which means they've got to cut spending, by the way, which is a difficult
He's also
thing
talking that up as
within
well. We'll
caucus.
see where they land. All right, our panel, Clare, Armstrong, Greg Brown, Paul Sakkal, back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Herald Sun in Melbourne, the one and only Mark Knight, and a very warm welcome.
Michael, great to see you.
Mark, there's a hell of a lot to pay attention to at the moment, and
Huge
certainly
week.
the RBA got our interest. Michelle Bullock seems to be playing a special game here. You've got rock, scissors, pain.
Well, it was a close decision, Mike, whether we hold interest rates where they are or we raise them. So what better way to make the decision with rock, paper, scissors?
It was a tight decision at the Reserve Bank board meeting.
Rock beats scissors. Looks like a rate rise wins.
They have your best interests at heart.
And here we are.
Yeah.
Which is, that's like those Pilates reformers, you know, that people put themselves, same sort of thing. It's good for you, I'm told.
Brett Lethbridge is adding a little fuel to the fire here. No shortage of fuel here. Jim's looking on a little bit troubled.
Well, and it's good to see that the Reserve Bank governor is hoarding fuel like the rest of us, and she has a jerry can ready for any such situation. That's right.
I love this, David Pope. It's true that if your weapon's a hammer, everything looks like a nail, isn't it? When all you've got is a stick, everything is a piñata.
Wait, is that the telltale tinkling sound of loose demand in the economy pushing up prices?
Yeah.
That's what it is, spare change.
Yeah.
And she's carrying, well, it's not a big stick, Mike, but it's certainly got a thwack to it.
It does. Megan Herbert has just drawn another weight being placed on the consumer here, and it was a very difficult decision as Home Jeeves in the chopper.
And look, I can feel that weight on me, this cartoon.
Mark, things are looking up, and unfortunately one of those things is the price of petrol. Lovely Harry Bruce cartoon.
Great cartoon. There's a contest on here.
Fuel and interest rates seem to be rising faster than a property auction in Sydney.
Just beautifully illustrates what's going on here.
Yeah, this was just a lovely Matt Golding cartoon.
Oh, beautiful.
It was a fuel crisis panic buy.
You just plug it into a chaff bag and away it goes.
Mark, nobody's announcing mission accomplished because nobody seems to know what the mission really is.
We're making it up as we go.
Lovely Kathy Wilcox, President Trump here, and presto.
Somebody come and clean up this mess. And that middle panel is just classic cartooning.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Isn't it?
I don't really know where to start here with this David Rove. Do you think that's crude oil?
It's very crude.
The stain of Hormuz with the little mobile here is lovely.
Yeah,
it's
cute.
AUKUS and Cuba and oil and
Loving
tacos.
the details.
Well, he's not going to change himself.
Are these like Louis XIV gold slippers or something like that?
He likes a bit of bling. That's the president of the US. Lovely Fiona Katauskas, Mark. He's got the suggested scene inside the Prime Minister's office.
And the messages from President Trump are, we've won bigly, we're winning strongly. Iran is so unfair on Hormuz. You wouldn't know any Iranian Delcy Rodriguez's, would you? Send your navy or don't. I don't care.
Keep telling him I'm not here. I think that's pretty accurate.
I would not be picking up if I was Albo at the moment.
No. Look, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week, mate. I'll let you do the honours.
Great to see you, Mike. And now it's back to you in the studio, Spearsy.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. Quick one from me. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, will be addressing the Australian Parliament on Tuesday. The long negotiated and awaited EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement will be signed. The EU has dropped its demands that Australia stop using product labels like feta and parmesan. So Aussie feta will stay, but that'll be a really interesting speech. Those negotiations, remember, they fell apart back in 2023, so they're finally coming to conclusion this week.
Well, we might get some cheaper Mercs and BMWs
and access to the big European market for our agriculture as well will be what they'll be selling as well.
And first female foreign leader to ever address the Australian Parliament.
There you go.
History. Bit of a sobering one from me. This week will be 1,000 days since the Murphy report by the late MP Peter Murphy is handed down. This basically set out a potential blueprint to manage problem gambling, really restrict advertising and go after a lot of the predatory behaviour from these companies. Still no formal response from the government, and though they've done some changes to address gambling, expect to see a big focus, particularly from the crossbench, on the fact that this remains a very unresolved issue domestically.
It's a long time. Greg.
RBA Governor Michelle Bullock again gave state and federal governments a leave pass on spending levels this week. I do think if there's not true spending restraint in the budget, and if state governments continue to thumb their nose at the need for restraint, I do think her language will become unsustainable, because if we don't see a pullback from governments, they'll need to bring aggregate demand down somehow, and that means higher interest rates, and the private sector will be hit.
Yeah. Paul.
I thought the split vote was a real dent to the RBA's authority this week. Questions about whether they should have that vote, those votes out there. Anyway, this isn't a discussion. In Victoria, there's a bit of Zoran Mumdani about Jess Wilson, the new opposition leader. She's got great social media. She's out in car parks talking about car theft. She's in her swimmers talking about the Commonwealth Games. I know Greg doesn't like these videos.
It was a horrendous video.
The
Commonwealth Games one, horrendous.
Horrendous video. The punters loved it.
Yeah, we probably don't have time, but we did have this as something we were going to discuss this morning.
She's a long way behind and she may not win, and the Liberal Party's got big problems there. But there is a really interesting dynamic in Victoria at the moment. Jacinta Allen, the Premier, there's been reports this week that she'll be rolled. I don't think that will eventuate, but that election's in November. So the next big test of One Nation support, a big moment for the Liberal Party to see if it kind of has a pulse. So a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, we will be keeping a very close eye on Victoria as the year goes on. Thank you all. Great chat this morning. Appreciate it. Finally, the Japanese Prime Minister was in the Oval Office this week, where the US President chose to ignore the immortal geopolitical advice of Basil Fawlty. Don't mention the war. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
We didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay? Right?
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.